So I'm going to discuss Ella minnow, one part that I found really interesting from it. Before I go there, one thing I want to talk about is something in relation to speech pathology. It's when Agnes writes the letter to Miss Mitty, and in this letter, it's on page 86. She says, "So terribly strange, how taxing it has become for me to speak, to write without these 4 illegal letters, but especially without the 4th. So I have chosen to stop talking, to stop writing altogether." This is something that really stood out to me because when I'm working with a client, most of the time they're going to be struggling with saying words, or maybe they can't communicate and they have to use one of those iPad systems. So I don't want them to be afraid to communicate. And I know the government was involved in the book and all of that, but it just was something that really stood out to me. But one thing that I want to point out is how towards the end of the novel, in the November time when most of the people have been banished from Nollup, how Ella is persistent and still communicates, which relates back to a bunch of the podcasts about how language is innate and how we have this desire to communicate. So even without what typical letters or typical sounds that we have in our language, there's still communication between Ella and the council. And you kind of have to make inferences about how or what is being said. So one of the things is I have Paula Minneum, and in this one they're kind of changing the spelling of things. So it's something as a child would not have a sound yet, so they'd be speaking like this. And then another one would be Tanya told me you were asking after me. I am fine. So that's when George Ann is writing to Ella saying she's fine, but everything's spelled differently. Fine is spelled with a PH. So as humans, we have this innate ability to communicate back to the first language, which relates back to the podcast, how they created their own language just to communicate, and off that things have developed. So I find it really interesting that after all of the hardships, there's still going to be communication, and of course at the end of the book everything ends up great and they're all able to speak regular again. But it was amazing that Ella especially really, she just was able to totally spin her mind and kind of just delete these certain letters from her vocabulary and still communicate with the people around her, which I thought was really amazing. And language and speech is something that's created in our brains, so we have to create our own language sometimes. When you think of sometimes studies of twins where they kind of communicate on their own, they make up their own little language. I know I have 2 little cousins, and when they were babies, you could tell they were communicating because they were looking at each other and you could tell they were comprehending, but no one else knew what was going on. So language is fascinating in that way, that no matter what, we're still able to communicate. And if we lose all of the languages, which would be very terrible, we would still find a way to make up our own language to communicate.